My name is Victoria Sterling, and at 33 years old, I've spent the last 14 years in the United States Army. I was stationed at Fort Hood, just outside Killeen, Texas. If you've ever lived around a military base, you know how it becomes part of everything. You see uniforms at Target on Saturday afternoons, soldiers grabbing coffee at Starbucks before sunrise, pickup trucks with Fort Hood decals parked outside H-E-B during grocery runs. It felt like home because, in a lot of ways, it was the only real home I'd ever had. Before we jump into today's story, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Take a second to tell me in the comments. Now, let's begin. 4 weeks before that dinner, I'd returned from a deployment overseas. Nothing glamorous, mostly logistics and operations. Long days, little sleep, plenty of responsibility. The Army paid me well because I'd earned it, one assignment at a time. Not because someone handed me anything. When my father called and invited me to Sunday dinner, I almost said no. We weren't close, hadn't been for years, but something in his voice sounded different that day. He said, "I'd like us all to have dinner together, just family." I remember standing in my kitchen after hanging up, staring at the refrigerator. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe age had softened everyone. Maybe I was just tired of carrying old disappointments. So I drove the 35 minutes from my townhouse near Fort Hood to my father's place in Killeen. The neighborhood hadn't changed. Same brick ranch houses. Same basketball hoop with no net. Same pecan tree my mother had planted when I was small. Seeing that tree always made my chest tighten. My mother died when I was 14. Breast cancer. Everything after that happened fast. My father met Patricia less than 18 months later. They married within 10 months. I tried with her. I really did. I never expected Patricia to replace my mother. I only hoped she'd treat me like I belonged. Instead, I always felt like an unexpected guest in my own family. Patricia wasn't openly cruel. She specialized in small things. She'd introduce me as James's daughter, like we weren't actually connected. She'd frame family pictures without including me. When relatives visited while I was deployed, she'd say things like, "Oh, Victoria's always off somewhere." Never once did she say she was proud I served. Dinner looked normal enough. Pot roast, green beans, homemade rolls, sweet tea in the same glasses my mother used to keep in the cabinet. Patricia had even baked pecan pie. Anyone walking in would have thought we were just an ordinary American family having Sunday supper. Conversation stayed light at first. Traffic on Interstate 35, gas prices. My cousin Mitchell's new house in Austin. My father barely talked. That wasn't unusual anymore. Then Patricia looked at me. "So," she said casually, "I was telling your father we've been thinking about remodeling the kitchen." "That's nice," I answered. "The cabinets are falling apart," she continued. "We've gotten a few estimates. Everything costs more these days." She smiled. "Which is why we figured maybe you could help." I blinked. "Help how?" "Financially," Patricia said simply. "You've got that government paycheck coming in every month." I laughed a little because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. "We're family," she continued. "It only seems fair." I laid my napkin beside my plate. "I've got bills too, and I'm saving for retirement." "But you're single," Patricia said. "You don't have dependents." "I still have a mortgage," I replied quietly. She waved her hand. "Oh, sweetheart, you're doing just fine." Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "Honestly, after everything your father sacrificed raising you, that army money belongs to the family." I slowly turned toward my dad. He stayed silent. That silence hurt more than her words ever could. It reminded me of every moment he'd chosen the easier path instead of standing beside me. When he skipped my basic training graduation because Patricia didn't like traveling. When he missed my promotion ceremony. When he forgot birthdays during deployments. Every excuse had sounded reasonable at the time. Taken together, they formed a pattern. I wasn't his priority anymore. I looked back at Patricia. "I already donate to organizations that help wounded veterans." She frowned. "Charity starts at home." "No," I replied quietly. "Respect starts at home." That's when I asked my father the question that made him sweat. I kept my voice calm, but I made sure both of them could hear every word. "Dad, do you know why the Army pays me?" He finally met my eyes. For just a second, I saw something I hadn't seen since I was younger. Fear, real fear. I leaned forward. "Tell your wife to stop talking about my money. It's mine, not hers. She needs to know her place. If she crosses that line again, I won't be polite." "Do you understand?" My father's face turned pale. Tiny beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Patricia's smile disappeared. Without another word, I stood up, picked up my keys, and walked out. The drive back to Fort Hood gave me too much time to think. Something about that dinner felt different from Patricia's usual boundary crossing. Something about my father's panic suggested this wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper, something hidden. I pulled over near Lake Belton and called the one person I could trust completely. Margaret Chen had been my mother's best friend since nursing school. She answered on the second ring. "Victoria? You sound upset." "I am," I said. "I think there's something about my family nobody ever told me." There was a long pause. I could hear evening sounds in the background at her end. Crickets. A distant highway. "Come see me tomorrow," Margaret finally said. "It's time we talked about some things." The drive to Waco took about 40 minutes the next morning. Margaret lived in the same white farmhouse she'd shared with her late husband for nearly 50 years. After he died, she refused to leave. "This house already knows all my stories," she'd told me once. "I don't see any reason to start over somewhere new." She met me on the front porch before I even reached the steps. "Oh, sweetheart, you look tired." "I've been better," I said. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. The kitchen radio played old country music softly. Everything about the place reminded me of my mother. She and Margaret had been best friends since nursing school. When Mom got sick, Margaret was there almost every day. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee mugs between us. For several minutes, neither of us said much. Finally, I broke the silence. "What happened after Mom died that nobody ever told me?" Margaret looked down into her coffee. "I hoped you'd never have to ask that question." "Please," I said. She took a slow breath. "Victoria, your mother loved you more than anything, but you don't know how much she worried about what would happen after she was gone." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "She knew your father wasn't good with money, not reckless exactly, but he made poor financial decisions. Your mother handled almost everything, the finances, the planning, all of it. He relied on her completely. That surprised me. My father had always acted responsible, steady, reliable." Margaret stood and disappeared into another room. A minute later, she returned carrying an old photo album. We flipped through page after page. Pictures from birthdays, camping trips, my high school soccer games, Mom smiling despite the chemotherapy. Then a folded envelope slipped out from between two pages. Margaret picked it up and stared at it for a moment. "Oh, I forgot this was here. What is it?" I asked. "It's a copy of your mother's insurance paperwork." I looked at her. "My mother's what?" She hesitated. "Victoria, after your mom passed away, there was life insurance, but not just what your father received. There was money specifically intended for you." The room suddenly felt much quieter. "What?" I whispered. She slid the paperwork toward me. I scanned the document. My own name appeared near the bottom. "Beneficiary." "I've never seen this before," I said. "I know. How much was it?" I asked. She answered carefully. "Enough to pay for college and give you a solid start in life." I stared at the papers. "That's impossible. I remember Dad telling me we couldn't afford college. He said I had to apply for scholarships because there wasn't any money." Margaret didn't answer. "When I graduated from high school, the scholarships I got weren't enough to cover all 4 years," I continued. "I worked 3 jobs my freshman year. I remember him saying that's just how it had to be." "You did receive some scholarships," Margaret said quietly, "but they weren't enough to cover everything." I looked back at the paperwork. My hands started shaking. "If there was money," I started. "There was," Margaret finished. Her eyes meeting mine, the drive home felt different. Like every memory I'd trusted had shifted slightly out of place. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the insurance wasn't enough. Maybe medical bills consumed it. Maybe my father had needed it just to survive. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. On Monday morning, before reporting to work, I stopped by the county's records office. The clerk explained how to request archived probate documents. That afternoon, during lunch, I submitted formal requests. Then I waited. Weeks passed. Life continued. Morning physical training, staff meetings, paperwork, equipment inspections. The routine helped keep my mind occupied until Patricia decided she wasn't finished. My cousin Stephanie called one evening. "Rachel, hey, I don't really know how to ask this. Is everything okay between you and your dad?" I paused. "Why?" "Patricia's been telling people you're demanding money from them. She said you've become kind of entitled." I nearly dropped my phone. What? I figured she was exaggerating, Stephanie continued. But she's been talking. Within another week, 2 more relatives called. An aunt I'd barely spoken to in years left me a voicemail saying families shouldn't fight over money. An uncle posted a vague Facebook status about children forgetting where they came from. Nobody asked me what actually happened. They simply accepted Patricia's version. For the first time since joining the army, I seriously considered deleting every social media account I had. Then, almost a month after visiting Margaret, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. Montgomery County Probate Court. I carried it inside without opening it, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and slowly unfolded the documents. Bank records, estate filings, account transfers. Most of it was difficult to understand until one page stopped me cold. A withdrawal, large enough to cover nearly all the remaining insurance proceeds. Authorized within 14 months of my mother's death. Signed by James Whitmore, my father. I stared at his signature again and again. It wasn't forged, it wasn't questionable. It was unmistakably his. I spent the rest of the evening going through every page. The money had moved from one account, then another, eventually into a joint account shared by James and Patricia. I wanted there to be another explanation. Maybe temporary, maybe a loan, maybe something perfectly legal. Instead, every page created another question. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I carried copies to the legal assistance office on post, not because I wanted to sue anyone. I simply needed someone to explain what I was looking at. An older civilian employee glanced over the documents while I waited. His name tag read David Harrison, grey hair, reading glasses, Army veteran. He studied the papers longer than I expected. Finally, he looked up. James Whitmore. Yes, I think I remember that name. My stomach tightened. From where? I worked legal assistance here years ago before retiring, he said slowly. I can't be certain, but I think your father's file involved something more than estate paperwork. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair and tapped one page gently. If I'm remembering correctly, there was another document, something your mother had arranged for you that never reached your hands. I walked out of that office with the folder tucked under my arm, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Whatever had happened after my mother died, I was only seeing the first layer. I didn't sleep much after that conversation. David's words kept circling in my head. The money isn't the biggest secret. What could be bigger than that? Tuesday morning, I took a personal day. The army teaches you to keep moving, finish the mission, deal with your feelings later. But this wasn't something I could file away until the weekend. I drove back to the county courthouse in Killeen. The probate clerk recognized me. Back again? I'm afraid so, she smiled sympathetically. I found a couple of additional files that weren't included in your first request. She disappeared into the records room and returned carrying a thin folder. These were attached separately. I found a quiet table near the window. Most of the folder contained legal notices I'd already seen. Then I reached the final envelope. It was addressed in neat handwriting to Victoria. My name written by someone who had been gone 18 years. I looked toward the clerk. She was helping another customer. Nobody was paying attention to me. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. I hadn't seen it since high school permission slips and birthday cards. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to read it. I simply traced the letters with my thumb. Then I started. My sweet Victoria, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you these things myself. I stopped. Tears blurred the page. I wiped my eyes and kept going. First, I need you to know something that I hope you'll never doubt. None of this is your fault. Not my illness. Not what happens after I'm gone. You deserve a full life. Please don't carry guilt that belongs to adults. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. Always worried about everyone else. The letter continued. I've set aside money for your education because I want you to have choices. Whether you become a doctor, a teacher, an engineer, or something neither of us has imagined yet, I want that decision to be yours, not dictated by finances. Then came the sentence that made me stop breathing. James promised me he would never use your inheritance for anything except your future. He understands how important this is. I stared at those words for a long time. She trusted him completely. She had no idea what would happen. I kept reading. I've also learned something during this illness. Money matters less than character. If life ever becomes difficult, remember that people can take many things from you, but they cannot take your integrity unless you give it away. Another page followed. If you ever choose military service, don't do it because someone tells you it's honorable. Do it only if you believe it will help you become the woman you're meant to be. I smiled. I'd joined the army years after she died. Nobody had pushed me. It had been my own decision. Somehow she had understood me anyway. The final paragraph was short. Trust your instincts. Stand kindly whenever you can. Stand firmly whenever you must. I will always love you, Mum. I folded the letter carefully. For several minutes, I simply sat there. People walked in and out of the courthouse. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Life kept moving. Mine had just changed forever. I drove to Lake Belton Park and parked overlooking the water. The letter rested on the passenger seat. Not once did my mother mention revenge. Not once did she talk about money as something to fight over. She talked about choices, integrity, strength, somehow that hurt even more because my father had broken a promise made to a dying woman. I wasn't angry, not immediately. I was heartbroken for both of them, for the family we might have been. By Thursday, word had spread through the extended family that I'd been digging through old financial records. Patricia made sure of that. My Aunt Helen called. "Victoria, honey, I just wanted to tell you that sometimes it's healthier to let the past stay in the past." I looked out my office window toward the training fields. What if the past never actually stayed there? What if it's been following me the whole time? She didn't answer. Instead, she quietly changed the subject. That told me everything. People suspected more than they'd admitted. They just didn't want to know for certain. The following Sunday, my phone buzzed while I was doing laundry. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Victoria, yes, it's David Harrison." "The legal office," I said. "That's right, I found something. Can't discuss it over the phone. When can we meet?" "This afternoon." "Absolutely." We met at a small coffee shop just outside Fort Hood. David arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase. After ordering black coffee, he sat across from me. "I remembered where I'd seen your father's name," he said. He opened the briefcase and slid an old notebook across the table. I kept personal notes after difficult consultations. No names were supposed to leave the office, but this was just a reminder for myself. I read a single sentence. "Father seeking advice regarding estate funds intended for minor child." Below it was his notation. "Advised not to transfer funds without proper legal authority." My stomach dropped. "He asked?" I whispered. David nodded. "He came in specifically asking whether he could legally use the money." "What did you tell him?" "The truth." I told him no. He absolutely knew he couldn't do it, but he ignored the advice anyway. The room seemed to shrink around me. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't desperation. This was a deliberate decision made by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. That evening, just after sunset, someone knocked on my townhouse door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, my father stood outside alone. No Patricia, no excuses, just him. I opened the door halfway. "Dad?" He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders seemed smaller. His hair had turned almost completely grey. "I won't stay long," he said. "What do you want? Can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. The Texas evening was humid. Cicadas buzzed loudly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked down. "I know you've been asking questions. I should have answered them years ago." "Then answer one now," I said. "When Mom died, did you know that money belonged to me?" His eyes filled with tears. Yes. The honesty landed harder than any lie ever could. "Why?" I asked. He covered his face with one hand. "I thought I'd replace it, eventually." "When?" My voice sounded strange. "I don't know. 5 years. 10, 20. I kept telling myself I'd fix everything before you found out." I felt tears running down my own face. "You didn't just spend money. You broke a promise to a dying woman." He nodded weakly. "I know. Does Patricia know the truth?" He looked up slowly. The answer surprised me. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I told her the money had always been mine, that it came from your mother's estate as part of my inheritance." I stared at him. "So she's been defending a lie she never knew was a lie?" "Yes." My father reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out something small, a key, brass, old. "What's that?" "Your mother's safety deposit box. I told you it was empty." I lied. "I think there are still things inside. Things she wanted you to have." I looked at the key resting in his trembling hand. For the first time since all of this began, I realized there might still be pieces of my mother waiting for me, and whatever was inside that box could change everything once again. I didn't sleep after my father handed me the key. I placed it on my kitchen counter and stared at it while the coffee maker burbled before dawn. A tiny brass key. It wasn't worth much, but it carried 18 years of unanswered questions. By 8 o'clock Monday morning, I was standing inside the downtown branch of Wells Fargo Bank in Killeen. The same bank my parents had used for as long as I could remember. A young teller looked at the paperwork I'd brought, then disappeared to speak with the branch manager. A few minutes later, a woman in her 60s walked over with a warm but professional smile. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm Jennifer Walsh. I understand you're here about a safety deposit box." I nodded and handed her the probate documents along with the key. She examined everything carefully before leading me into the vault. The room was surprisingly ordinary. Grey metal boxes lined the walls. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead. No dramatic music, no hidden passageways. Just another Monday morning at the bank. Jennifer unlocked one side. I inserted the key my father had given me. The box slid open. Inside were only a few items. A small jewelry pouch, several photographs, my parents' marriage certificate, and one sealed envelope. This one was also addressed in my mother's handwriting, family records. Unlike the personal letter I'd already found, this envelope contained practical documents, copies of insurance policies, property records, receipts, a handwritten inventory. Near the bottom was a yellow legal pad page with notes in my mother's neat handwriting. One line caught my attention immediately. Victoria's education fund never to be used for household expenses. James understands and agrees. There it was again. Another reminder, another promise. Not legally explosive, not some movie-style confession. Just quiet evidence that my mother's intentions had always been clear. Jennifer left me alone while I looked through everything. When I finished, I carefully placed the papers back into the envelope. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't looking for more proof. I had enough. The real question was what to do with it. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my cousin Stephanie. "Are you coming Saturday? Coming where?" "The Morgan family reunion. It's in August. Every year at the Veterans Memorial Hall." I had completely forgotten. Every August, relatives from Texas gathered for barbecue, potluck, desserts, and children running around. Normally, I skipped it. "You should come," Stephanie said quietly. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because Patricia plans to tell everyone her side of the story." To everyone. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. For the next 2 days, I wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted nothing to do with any of it. I'd spent years building a peaceful life. Good friends, a career I loved, neighbors who knew me as a soldier, not as someone's wounded daughter. Walking into that reunion felt like stepping backward. Then I remembered my mother's letter. Stand kindly whenever you can. Stand firmly whenever you must. This was one of those moments. Saturday arrived hot and humid. The kind of Texas summer day where your shirt sticks to your back before noon. I parked outside the Veterans Memorial Hall just before 11. Pickup trucks already filled the lot. The smell of smoked brisket drifted through the air. Inside, folding tables were covered with casseroles, baked beans, potato salad, and enough desserts to feed twice the crowd. For a little while, everything felt almost normal. People hugged me. Several cousins thanked me for my military service. An older uncle asked whether I was ever going to retire. Kids chased each other around the flagpole outside. I almost convinced myself Stephanie had been mistaken. Then lunch ended. Patricia stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. "I just wanted to thank everyone for coming," she said warmly. "You all know families go through difficult seasons. I knew exactly where this was headed. We've had some misunderstandings lately." Her eyes found mine across the room. "Sometimes success changes people. I just hope someday Victoria remembers where she came from." Silence settled over the room, then she added, "Money isn't everything." I felt dozens of eyes turning toward me. For one brief moment, I considered staying seated, letting it go, driving home, never seeing any of these people again. Life would certainly be easier, but easier isn't always the same as right. I stood. "May I say something?" Patricia shrugged. "Of course." I walked slowly to the front of the room. No rush, no anger, just steady steps. "I don't want anyone here to choose sides," I said. "I also don't want rumors replacing facts." I placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies, not originals. I'd learned from the army to keep important documents safe. I brought these because several family members have heard different versions of the same story, I continued. I opened the folder. The first documents are copies of my mother's insurance records. The second group shows where those funds went. The third contains handwritten notes from my mother explaining exactly what those funds were intended for. Nobody interrupted. I looked at my father. He was sitting alone near the back. He looked exhausted. I handed copies to Stephanie, Uncle Marcus, Aunt Helen, and 2 others sitting nearby. Please read them. The room grew unusually quiet. Paper rustled. Pages turned. Expressions changed. Uncle Marcus adjusted his glasses. Aunt Helen covered her mouth. Nobody spoke. Finally, Patricia broke the silence. This doesn't prove anything. Before I could answer, my father stood up. Every chair creaked as people turned toward him. Frank Morgan wasn't a man who liked attention. He cleared his throat once, then again. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. It proves enough. Patricia frowned. What are you talking about? The money, he said. Wasn't mine to take. I told you it was, I know. You said Victoria was making everything up. I lied. The room became so quiet the ceiling fan seemed loud. Patricia stepped backward as though someone had pushed her. For 18 years, I've believed she was trying to take something from us. I know, he whispered. You let me resent her. I know. He looked at her with tears in his eyes. I never told you the whole truth about any of it. Confusion spread across her face. What truth? I spent money that belonged to Victoria, her inheritance, her future. I told you it had always been mine. That was a lie. She stared at him, her face losing all color. You told me she was making everything up. I did. You said she was selfish, ungrateful. I know what I said. After several long seconds, Patricia slowly turned toward me. Tears filled her eyes. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I looked at her quietly. I was wrong about you, she continued. But I want you to know, I wasn't wrong about everything. We've never exactly liked each other, have we? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. We haven't, I acknowledged. But I built my opinion on a lie I didn't even know was a lie, she said. And I treated you poorly because of it. For years, I let your father convince me that you were the problem instead of asking questions. There wasn't some dramatic embrace. No tears across the room. Just 2 women finally speaking honestly. Then I surprised everyone, including myself. I didn't come here asking for money, I said. I don't want reimbursement. What I wanted was for the truth to stop hiding. I turned toward my father. You've carried this long enough. He nodded silently. Tears rolled down his face. One by one, relatives who had believed the rumors quietly apologized. Not every person did. A few slipped out without saying anything. That was fine. Not every wound closes in a single afternoon. The family pastor, who had known my parents for decades, stopped beside my father and rested a hand gently on his shoulder. James, he said softly, the hardest confession is usually the one we've rehearsed for years. My father nodded. Now comes the harder part, the pastor continued, living honestly. I stood outside a little later, watching children chase fireflies in the early evening. For the first time in years, my chest felt lighter, not because I'd won, because I no longer had to carry someone else's secret. 4 months after the family reunion, life looked surprisingly ordinary. That was the funny thing about major turning points. You expect fireworks afterward. Instead, you still have laundry to fold, groceries to buy, and Monday morning meetings that could have been emails. I was back into my usual routine at Fort Hood. My alarm went off at 5:15 every weekday. Coffee, physical training, a quick shower, uniform pressed the night before, out the door before sunrise. Some mornings as I drove through the main gate, I'd catch the first light spilling over the training fields. Soldiers were already running in formation, calling cadence. Mechanics were opening maintenance bays. The post was waking up just as it had every morning for decades. There was comfort in that rhythm. No matter what had happened with my family, the army still expected me to show up prepared, focused, and dependable. And somehow that steadiness helped me heal. One Friday afternoon, my battalion commander called me into his office. "Have a seat, Captain Sterling." I sat down, wondering if I'd forgotten some report. Instead, he smiled and handed me a folder. Inside was confirmation of my promotion board results. I had been selected for Major. "You earned it," he said. "Congratulations." As I walked out of headquarters, I thought about every person who had helped me reach that moment. Drill sergeants who pushed me harder than I thought I could handle. Leaders who corrected me when I made mistakes. Friends who became family during deployments. None of them had asked what my last name meant. None of them cared about old family arguments. They judged me by my work. That was one of the greatest gifts the army had ever given me. A week later, I stopped by Margaret's farmhouse. She insisted on baking an apple pie because promotions deserve dessert. When I told her about the reunion, she listened quietly. "Do you feel better?" she asked. I thought about it. "Yes, and I'm also sad." She nodded. Those two feelings can live in the same heart. What exposing the truth usually does is make healing possible. Not completion, just the chance to heal. That sentence stayed with me. Healing wasn't an event, it was a process. My father wrote me his first letter about a month after the reunion. Not a text, not an email, a handwritten letter. His handwriting looked shakier than I remembered. "Victoria, I've started meeting with a counsellor through the Veterans Clinic. I should have done this years ago. I've spent too much of my life avoiding difficult conversations because I was afraid of disappointing people. Ironically, that's exactly how I disappointed everyone. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that one day you'll believe I'm trying to become a better man than the one you've known." I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it inside the same box where I kept my mother's letters. I didn't answer immediately, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted my response to be honest. 2 weeks later, I finally wrote back. It wasn't long. I thanked him for telling the truth. I told him I hoped counseling would help, and I told him something I never thought I'd say. Trust grows slowly, but I'm willing to let time do its work. Patricia surprised me even more. One Saturday morning, she called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hello, Victoria. Yes, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you meet me for coffee?" Curiosity got the better of me. We met at a little cafe in downtown Killeen with mismatched chairs and homemade muffins. She looked nervous. "I've rehearsed this conversation about 50 times, she admitted. "I can tell," I said. She gave a small laugh. "I deserve that." For several moments, she stirred her coffee without drinking it. Finally, she looked at me. "I owe you an apology that doesn't include excuses. I believed what your father told me because it was easier than asking questions. But I also chose to believe the worst about you. I treated you like you didn't belong." I appreciated that she wasn't pretending we'd always gotten along. "I was wrong," she continued, "and I can't undo those years, but I can stop adding to them." When we left, she asked one more question. "Would it be all right if I came to your promotion ceremony?" I smiled. "I think that would be okay." A month later, I stood in dress uniform inside a ceremony room at Fort Hood. Friends from my unit filled most of the seats. Margaret sat in the front row. To my surprise, my father and Patricia arrived together. They sat quietly. They didn't try to make the day about themselves. After the ceremony, my father walked over. He looked at the gold oak leaf on my uniform. "I should have been here for the others," he said quietly. I nodded. "You should have. I'm here now. You are." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a real one. That fall, I used part of my savings to establish a small scholarship in my mother's name. Nothing enormous, just enough to help one military child each year after losing a parent. During the first award ceremony, I spoke for only a few minutes. I didn't mention my family. I didn't mention the money. Instead, I said this. My mother believed that education gives people choices. I hope this scholarship honors that belief. Afterward, one of the students, a 17-year-old girl whose father had died while serving overseas, walked up to me. She smiled nervously. "Thank you." I smiled back. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes," she said softly. "I think I do." As she walked away, I realized something. That scholarship was worth far more than the money my father had taken all those years ago. Because it couldn't be stolen. It was already doing what my mother had wanted from the beginning, helping someone build a future. People sometimes ask me whether I got revenge. I usually smile. If revenge means humiliating someone or making them suffer, then no, that wasn't what happened. The hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. The hardest part was refusing to become bitter after I learned it. What finally brought me peace wasn't recovering money. It was recovering my own voice. For years, I'd stayed quiet because I didn't want to create conflict. Eventually, I learned that silence doesn't always protect a family. Sometimes it protects the lie that's hurting the family. The army never paid me just to wear a uniform. It paid me for long nights away from home, for missed birthdays and holidays, for responsibility, for decisions made under pressure, for choosing duty even when it was difficult. No one else had earned that paycheck. No one else had the right to claim it. If you've listened this far, thank you for spending your time with me. If this story reminded you that self-respect and kindness can exist together, I hope you'll carry that thought with you. And if you've ever had to face a painful family truth, I hope you know you're not alone.